Hey everyone, welcome back. Thanks for tuning in. We've got a brand new story for you today, so let's dive right in. Thanks for coming, Karen. Are the kids okay? Yeah, they're fine, Jess. Mike's watching them. They were sound asleep when I left. Did you ask him about the bail money? The cop said it'd be around 50 grand, but you get it back, right? Once the charges are dropped. Yeah, about that. Mike asked why Mark isn't paying, and honestly, I'm wondering the same thing. Well, I'm really hoping this whole thing will blow over before Mark gets back in 2 days. It's all just a misunderstanding. Once Chris wakes up, he'll clear everything up, and the charges will be dropped. There's no need to stress Mark out. Who's Chris? I think you better start this whole story from the beginning, don't you? The disheveled woman on the other side of the interrogation room bars, in the holding cell, looked incredibly uncomfortable. She was mentally bracing herself for the conversation ahead. In the last few days, she'd thought a lot about having this kind of talk, or something like it, with her husband Mark. But there really hadn't been anyone else to confide in. Now, she desperately needed to shed some light on everything she'd done. Maybe, given her current situation, it seemed a bit dirty, even in her own mind, not to mention selfish. But she had to lay it all out to get her sister's help and, more importantly, avoid having this conversation with Mark. Breaking eye contact, Jessica Brown began her story. Chris is my work husband. What the hell is a work husband? Oh, Karen, you've always been a bit of a prude. Jessica tried a weak smile. These days it's like trendy. Tons of girls in my office have work husbands. I'll ask again, what the hell is a work husband, Jess? Karen's voice was firm, laced with impatience. Why the hell is my sister living in the dark ages? Jessica muttered under her breath. Well, I think it's just a distraction, you know. A way to relieve stress or boredom at work. It's a guy in the office who, dates all the girls, and at work they act like husband and wife. Karen stared at her sister, skeptical as hell. How much like husband and wife? Oh, you know. We look out for each other. Tell him when his fly is down. Cheer him up if he's feeling down. Go to lunch together. Stuff like that. Jessica shrugged, trying to downplay it. And what about the more popular things husbands and wives do? Karen pressed, her tone sharp. Jessica thought fast. Could she avoid telling her sister the rest? No. She knew the whole story couldn't stay hidden. Without full disclosure, none of this would make any sense. She mentally braced herself for the inevitable judgment. Well, yeah, just sex during work, you know. Or sometimes pretending we're working late and doing it in the office after everyone's left. But it only happened 4 or 5 times. Mostly it was just in a motel room across the street during extended lunch breaks. Saying it out loud, Jessica started to really hear how pathetic her reasoning sounded. She avoided looking Karen in the eyes and fell silent. And this time it wasn't an extended lunch break or working late. You called me after midnight. Karen's voice was cold. Ah, I get it. Mark was out of town on a business trip, wasn't he? So this was a case of lying to your sister to get her to babysit your kids while you spent the whole night with your so-called work husband, wasn't it? Jessica's downward glance was the only answer Karen needed. And how many times have I had to watch your kids while you were betraying Mark? I am not happy about being made an accomplice, Jess. I swear, Karen, it was the first time, honestly. If I had to place a bet, I'd still consider you truthful by nature, Jess. But why is that, sis? Is this the first time his wife has been away? Karen's skepticism was palpable. No, he's not married, Jessica answered quickly. Well then, everything's fine. At least he's not committing adultery. Relieved that the worst seemed to be over, Jessica let her sister's sarcasm slide and answered without hesitation, "No, he's a decent guy. He'd never do something like that." Jessica's brain finally caught up with her mouth, and her face flushed bright red. Karen just looked at her younger sister and shook her head, thinking, not for the first time, about how their parents had spoiled their youngest child. "And what about your husband, Jess? What about Mark? What are you going to say when it's him sitting across from you, not me?" For a moment, Jessica panicked. "I told you, if you get me out of here in the morning, Chris will wake up and tell the police what really happened. Then Mark will never have to find out, unless, of course, I tell him." Karen paused before adding, "Or Mike. If you do this, Jess, the potential collapse of my family will be on your shoulders. The kids will be left without a father because of you." Karen's voice was low and serious. Jessica looked defiantly at Karen, who stared back in disbelief. She knew her younger sister had always struggled to take responsibility for her mistakes, but this was ridiculous. "Fine, you're wrong, Jess. But even if Mike and I don't say anything, Mark will catch you eventually. In the end, cheaters always get caught. What was your plan if he finds out?" "I hadn't even thought about it, until one evening last week when Mark almost caught Chris and me." "What happened?" Karen asked, her voice laced with dread. "I called Mark and told him he'd have to make dinner for the kids because I was working late. But it wasn't work, was it?" Karen already knew the answer and couldn't hide her disappointment in her younger sister. Jessica, however, didn't notice. "No, the office was empty and the front door to the building was locked. But that damn cleaning lady let Mark in. The stupid fool, he brought me dinner. Luckily, Chris had just finished bending me over the desk, and thankfully, I had the sense to lock my office door when Mark knocked. I had to hold my underwear tightly to keep anything from dripping onto the floor." Jessica's voice was almost casual, as if recounting a funny anecdote. "Chris and I got ourselves presentable in record time, and I opened the door. Lucky for me, Mark is so naive that he bought our story about the door accidentally locking." Karen flinched and just shook her head. "So, after your brilliant evasion, what was your clever plan in case Mark actually caught you?" "Well, according to my friend Jen, I don't need to do anything. If Mark kicks me out, I'll get everything. Custody of the kids, the house, alimony. Apparently, as long as the mother isn't in prison, she gets it all. My plan was simply to point that out to Mark, because then he'd never leave me. He lives for the kids. I don't think you'll need to explain that to him, Jess, especially after what his first wife put him through." Both of them reflected on the well-known tragic story of Mark's first marriage. An ambush by his wife and her lover, a lawyer, fabricated accusations of physical abuse that allowed his ex-wife to secure a full restraining order. Constant whispers in the children's ears until they eventually refused to speak to their father, even over the phone. Karen had tears in her eyes as she sympathized with Mark's hopeless situation. She felt ashamed to be related to Jessica. How could Jessica even think of doing something like that to her husband? "You're right, Jess. It will destroy him if he has to go through this again." "Exactly," Jessica exclaimed, relieved that Karen seemed to be seeing her point of view. Karen stared at the despicable creature her sister had become and felt an overwhelming urge to wipe that smirk off her face. Then again, you never know for sure. Mark is smart. He might come up with a solution that will catch you off guard. "No, Karen, the worst thing that could happen is that I lose Mark but gain everything else," Jessica stated confidently. "If Mark throws you out, you can always sleep with Chris," Karen said dryly. "Not after what that scumbag did to me. I can't believe they're accusing me of assault. I was just defending myself. That idiot took advantage of me." Jessica's voice rose in indignation. "What? Your work husband took advantage of you?" Karen's voice dripped with sarcasm. "Well, coercion in relationships is quite a hot topic right now." "All right, Jess. Tell me the rest." Karen sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "You said he was a decent guy, so how exactly did a decent man end up doing that to you?" Karen's sarcasm went completely unnoticed by Jessica. She paused for a moment before deciding to tell her sister the whole dirty story, no matter how awkward it might be. "Well, as I already said, I never had a full night with Chris before. Just a few episodes at the motel and a couple of quickies in the office. So when Mark said he was going to Albany for 3 days, I jumped at the chance to see what Chris was really like." "No need to roll your eyes, Karen. I get it. You disapprove. This is my life, and it was my choice." Jessica snapped, defensive. "After dropping the kids off at your place, I had dinner with Chris, and then I called Mark like I always do when he's away." "How do you do it, Jess? How do you talk to your husband like nothing's happening?" Karen's voice was barely a whisper, full of pain and confusion. Jessica knew exactly what her sister was asking, but she couldn't offer a simple answer. Only she understood the inner turmoil she had gone through when her affair with Chris began. The guilt and confusion of those early days had faded, replaced by the growing realization that deceiving Mark was easier than she had ever imagined. She chose not to answer Karen, letting her question hang unanswered in the air. After talking to Mark, making sure he was fine and asking to speak to the kids, Chris and I carried on with our plans. I have to admit it wasn't as exciting as I thought it would be. When we'd gone to the motel, it had felt rushed, but thrilling. At work, it was cliché, sure, but it had been a little more exciting than routine. But last night felt different, almost dull. I suppose I'd built it up in my mind, and in reality it just couldn't match the fantasy. Chris isn't really into foreplay. Before I knew it, we were right back into it, and when it was done, he rolled over and passed out. He'd drunk most of a bottle of wine during dinner. I dozed off for a bit, but then I woke up feeling restless, a desire lingering that wouldn't let go. So I woke him up. "Sorry, I'm rambling. You don't need all the details, do you?" Jessica asked, suddenly self-conscious. "Anyway, once he was awake, I didn't want to make the same mistake. I decided to get on top of him, but he stopped me and said I needed a shower first. I hadn't even gotten the water just right when everything went dark. He said the fuses kept tripping in the old house. I waited for him to come back, but after 10 minutes, there was no sign of him. I thought maybe he was looking for a flashlight or fixing the fuse, but nothing. I called out, thinking he was in the bedroom, but there was only silence. I started to get dressed, planning to leave, but my clothes were still in the bedroom." Karen yawned, feeling the weight of her sister's words dragging on. It was already late, and the inconsistency in Jessica's story was starting to annoy her. I felt my way to the bedroom, thinking I'd find the bed, but then Chris grabbed me from behind and shoved me onto it. The next thing I knew, he had me by the hips, and I could feel him against me. Mark and I sometimes played out forced scenarios. It's a thing of mine, so I went along with it, trying to relax. Jessica's cheeks flushed, her confession awkward and uncomfortable. She quickly glanced down at her hands, twisting the rings around her fingers, too embarrassed to look at her sister. But then I felt his hand leave my hip, and I noticed something cold being applied. I told Chris he didn't need to do that. I was already ready. The situation got intense when I felt his hands adjusting my position. I shifted to accommodate him, and then, out of nowhere, he shifted in a way that caught me off guard. It hurt, Karen. It hurt so much. Jessica stopped speaking, her face showing the lingering discomfort of the memory. The physical pain and the shock of being treated this way by someone she thought cared about her flooded her mind. "What did you do?" Karen's voice snapped Jessica out of her trance. I yelled at him, sharp and desperate. "What did he do?" Karen pressed, her voice tight with concern. "He held me tight and just kept going, like it didn't matter. It hurt so much." Jessica's voice trembled. "How did it end?" Karen asked, her patience wearing thin. At some point, he loosened his grip and I managed to break free. I scrambled across the bed, feeling around until my hands brushed something. Something hard. Let me backtrack a bit. When I first entered Chris's bedroom, there had been a baseball bat leaning against the wall. I asked him about it, and he said there had been a few break-ins in the neighborhood, hoodlums, so he kept it nearby. Now, with everything happening, I started to wonder if he planned to use it on me if he couldn't overpower me. Karen watched as Jessica's realization hit, the color draining from her face as the true horror of the situation sank in. I grabbed the bat. I swung it as hard as I could. I felt it hit him, heard him scream in the darkness. I ran back to the bathroom, locked the door behind me, and fumbled for the window. I couldn't get it open, but then my foot bumped into a trash can. I grabbed it and smashed the window. I started screaming, hoping someone would hear me. "And then what happened?" Karen asked, her voice barely audible. "I heard sirens, then the police. One officer followed me downstairs while the other went upstairs. Soon I could hear them calling for an ambulance. I told the officer I didn't need one when I got dressed. They led me to the police car and started asking questions. I told them what happened, how Chris had taken advantage of me, and I had defended myself. They took me to the hospital, did some tests, and then brought me here. They charged me with assaulting Chris and took my fingerprints. They found Chris unconscious by the bed. They told me they'd hold me here until the bail hearing tomorrow. Couldn't call Mark, so I called you." Jessica finished her story, looking at Karen with pleading eyes. Karen looked at Jessica with pity, seeing how much her sister had been through, but she still couldn't understand how Jessica could have gotten into this mess. "What's your plan for telling Mark about this, Jess?" Karen asked, her voice heavy with concern. "Well, once Chris wakes up, he'll tell them it was self-defense, and they'll drop the charges," Jessica repeated, clinging to this hope. Karen stared at her sister, pity and disbelief warring within her. She knew the truth. Chris wasn't the type to be noble enough to admit to coercion. Jessica, in her desperation, couldn't see that reality. Before Karen could voice her thoughts, a plainclothes detective entered, signaling it was time for her to leave. After Karen left, the detective settled into the empty chair across from Jessica, his eyes shifting between her and the statement he was reading. Jessica tried to read his expression, desperately hoping that Chris had told the truth. Finally, the detective set the paper aside, locking eyes with her. "So, let me clarify, Mrs. Brown," he said, his tone even, detached. "For several months, you've been having an affair with your work husband behind your husband's back. On the evening your husband was out of town, you decided to spend the night at your lover's house. During your time together, you interrupted for a shower, at which point the power went out. When your lover didn't return, you claimed that you went back to the bedroom and he attacked you using force. You then say you found a baseball bat on the bed and hit him once, is that correct? Jessica nodded, her heart pounding. Yes, I've already told you everything. As soon as Chris regains consciousness, he needs to confirm that everything I said is true. True? The detective sighed, his face hardening slightly. I'm afraid he hasn't. And it's my duty to inform you that you've gone from being a work wife to a work widow. He paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. Mr. Chris Smith died without regaining consciousness. He was found on the bedroom floor, between the bed and the wall, suffering from severe head injuries. Doctors believe he was struck up to 7 times, mostly while he was lying on the floor, likely unconscious. The baseball bat found at the scene had your fingerprints on it, along with the deceased. Jessica Brown, you are being charged with second-degree murder. The detective's words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with finality. I remind you that you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you. At that moment, Jessica felt the world around her blur and falter. The room spun before her, and she fainted, collapsing into the chair, her body going limp. Meanwhile, across town, Mark Brown was reviewing his answers to the police officer's questions. He had checked into a motel just outside the city earlier that afternoon, around 5:00 p.m. He had an early dinner in the motel restaurant, which he was certain could be confirmed by the waitress, a red-haired woman in her 30s wearing glasses. After dinner, he had returned to his room alone and without witnesses, preparing for a business meeting the next day. The only phone call he had made or received was from Jessica's cell phone around 9:30 p.m. Oddly, she had used her cell instead of the home phone, but he hadn't thought much of it at the time. No, he didn't know Chris Smith, nor had he ever interacted with his wife's colleagues. It all seemed so strange. Couldn't they at least tell him what was going on? After the officers left, Mark called both the home phone and Jessica's cell, leaving worried messages, asking her to call him back. As he considered his next move, he rubbed his bruised bicep and absent-mindedly slipped his hands into his pockets. To his surprise, he pulled out 2 latex gloves. A wry smirk curled on his lips as he stared at them. If the police had searched him, it could have ruined all the plans he had so carefully put into motion. He cursed under his breath for not being more thorough. His children needed him to stay focused, and this mistake could cost him dearly. Pulling back the curtains, he saw that the police car had left. He took a deep breath and stepped out of the room, crossing the road to the back of the shopping center. He glanced around to ensure no one was watching before reaching into his pocket again and tossing the gloves into a dumpster. The latex gloves were joined by a pair of night vision goggles, a disposable coverall, and a fuse box he had discarded earlier. All traces of his actions disappearing into the darkness. Returning to his room, Mark began packing, the exhaustion in his limbs reminding him of how much work he still had to do. But he didn't stop. He carefully planned each step, knowing exactly what he needed to do to become a successful single parent. A faint smile crept onto his lips as he reflected on the difficult work he had done, work that had been done well, no matter the cost. And with that, the story took a darker turn. It was a tale of secrets, manipulation, and twisted desires. Thank you for listening to the end. I'll see you in the next video.